Hey, everybody, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. Today's podcast is an interview with Henry Shires, founder and president of Tarptent.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we talk about the gear, skills, and philosophy of lightweight backcountry travel. I'm your host, Andrew Marshall, and today we're talking to tent designer and small business owner Henry Shires of Tarptent. If you've got a toe in the ultralight backpacking world, you've doubtless heard of Tarptent. The company is known for spacious, light, well-constructed shelters. I'm super stoked to be talking to Henry today, as I myself have spent nearly 200 nights in tarp tents of various designs. Henry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
I want to get started with your philosophy around design, and then we can jump back in time and talk about sort of how you started this whole
Sure.
journey. But can you give us a brief overview of what you would consider your design ethic or your design philosophy?
Well, I mean, actually, I think those two questions are very related in the sense that I got into this, um, ultimately as a result of a tent that I designed for my own use for my 1999 PCT through hike, and it was a very simple little shelter that was sort of a basic A-frame with one long edge raised and some mosquito netting and floorless, and and for me it was my way, and using some sil nylon, which came out of was around at the time, but it just seemed like for me it was the simplest thing I could think of that had enough space, usable space for me in my attempts to through hike the PCT. And back in those days, I had no idea what I was doing with respect to tent design. I mean, I do have a physics degree, but I had never designed anything before, anything remotely like that. But it got me thinking about what it takes to solve the problem. And then I used it, of course, on for 4+ months, and that would have been the end of it. But then my wife borrowed it the next year to use it to hike the JMT, and came home and and informed me that it was too hard to set up, which I found rather shocking because it was fine for me. But anyway, that got me to work on getting serious about making something that was easier to set up, and got me into the world of 3D CAD modeling. And long story, here we are today. But really, it was about solving the problem, which was how do I keep the rain and the bugs off me during my long hike. And I think I'm still there. I mean, every tent we do is in that realm, is how do we solve this problem. But what has changed over the years, the aesthetic. I mean, I'm much more finely tuned now to the aesthetic of the thing, and that's what keeps me going. That I look at tents, and I just think they're just so infinitely variable with respect to the architecture. And so that drives me. I get I get this perverse kick out of looking at tent designs that I don't at all feel from like packs, which to me are a bag with straps. I can't wrap my head around the beauty of a pack. But tents for me are that's it. It's the problem solving, but it's also the aesthetic of the finished product.
That certainly explains why Tarptent has stuck with tents and hasn't branched out into packs. I actually was going to ask you that later in the
Yeah.
interview. So,
Yeah, I don't know what I would bring to the party, and I don't have a passion for it, so I don't. For me, it just doesn't work.
yeah, you talked about designing a tent for your PCT hike. How did you go from, okay, I'm going to through hike the PCT to I need to design a shelter for the PCT?
Prior to hiking the trail, for some reason, I posted some plans on how to make that particular shelter design that I came up with on this site that's still around, called backpacking.net, I think. Does that sound right? I think it's still in existence. And anyway, I posted some plans there, and I kept getting emails from people both during the hike and afterwards wanting, to make one for them, which I thought was rather odd. And
Mm-hmm.
I just kept saying, well, here's some plans, and go find a sewer and have fun. And um, and that really honestly would have been the end of it. But it was this attempt to make something simpler to set up that I put a lot of time into, thinking it was just going to take me a few days, and it took me months. And I ultimately ended up getting a hiking friend of a friend to sew some tents up. thinking there'd be a few other people on the planet who might want one, and it snowballed from there. But really, it was, it was driven by external forces, not so much my desire to, solve, make the ultimate tent or turn it into a business. Certainly.
Right. So as you were preparing for your hike, were you looking around at possible shelters and going, "Oh, gee, I'm just really unsatisfied with all my options." Is that kind of what was happening?
So I had purchased, actually a few years before that, a Stevenson's warm light, for just general hiking use. And this was actually before I decided to hike the PCT. And then I started looking at my gear and going, well, this thing's just way too heavy for what I want it for. But the fabric was, the steel nylon fabric was the thing. And I thought, well, I could probably just make a really simple shelter basically out of the same fabric and save a whole bunch of weight. And so that's sort of, that was ultimately the genesis of the fabric, the materials. And then the design element was, of course, I read the book, the Ray Jardine book. His name escapes me now, but can't remember the name of it. But it was about making your own gear, among other things, kind of the lightweight philosophy.
All right. Well, we'll find it. We'll find it and put a link to the show notes.
Anyway, but it got me thinking about making my own gear, and then, which products, which materials would I use for it, and so that there were definitely some outside influences that got me into the materials that would go into the thing that I needed it to do.
Well, let's walk through your process from the germ of an idea to a completed
Yeah.
shelter. So at this point, what Tarptent has, what, 12 or 13 different shelters?
I think it's almost closer to 20. We've had to take a couple out of production during 2019 due to some production problems, but yeah, we're going to be up closer to 20 in 2020. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. So walk us through from start to finish. Do you identify a problem that needs solving and then go from there, or does something just pop into your head?
Yeah, it's a little of both. It's a bit of an organic process, and that something just sort of sticks in my head about a particular need or a design element that I'm looking. If you look at our products, actually over the years, a lot of them have, it's a bit like evolution in that we find a little design element that works and then sort of recombine it to make something else. So if you look carefully at our product line over the past few years anyway, there's this thing we now call the pitch lock corner, which is two little carbon fiber tubes in a triangular configuration, which fold flat. And that's actually a design element that we put into a lot of tents certainly in the last decade. And so it's combining various elements to solve the problem, which is, again, how do you keep the rain and the bugs off of you? And so I think of tents as skeletons with skins. So the skeleton is the pole structure, and of course the skin is the fabric that goes over the top of it. And then it's how do you get the most usable volume out of those sort of basic structural elements, which is, the advantage of this thing we call the pitch lock corner. To me, it's very light, but it's very strong, and it adds quite a bit of usable volume, especially at the ends of a tent. So there's that, and then it's, of course, the funny story I should tell you actually is that way back in the day, I was not then, nor have ever been, a trekking pole user. And the first tent that we put out was called the Virga. It was a little solo tent with ultimately a single trekking pole in front and a little arch pole in the back. And it never crossed my mind that you could use a trekking pole up front in lieu of a standard tent pole. So the tents we put out there had a little lightweight little aluminum pole, and then I kept getting responses from people going, "Hey, I like your tent. I don't use your little pole because I just use my trekking pole." And it was like, ding, ding, ding. Of course you do. It never crossed my mind that you would repurpose your trekking pole for that. But anyway, these days, quite a few of our tents use trekking poles, and I continue to not use them, but I get it. If you're using them, you should definitely repurpose them if you can, to hold your tent up.
So we talked about usable space, or usable volume, which is a big deal for you guys, and the pitch lock corners. Talk to me about probing the polyhedra. What does that mean?
How do you fully enclose a person or persons? So you need some sort of geometrical structure over you to keep the wind and the rain and the bugs out. So generally it falls into some sort of polyhedral structure. By that I mean flat surfaces that are sort of glued together or sewn together, triangles or rectangles or pentagons or whatever it is, over your living space, or sort of true hemispherical structures. But one way or the other, it's about how do you link a bunch of surfaces over the top of you in order to contain and shelter you. And so probing the polyhedras, if you look at something like, the Stratospire design, for example, on our site, there's a fun little video we did of sort of a top-down flyover of that thing, and you can really see the geometry of that. So it's a bunch of triangles put together to form the structure over the top of you. And the other thing about polyhedra is there are distinct breaks in the surface. So unlike, say, a hemisphere where it's a continuous curved surface, a polyhedral surface has distinct breaks. So it has distinct lines, and those are typically seam lines, and they're tensionable lines. And so what you want to do generally is allow for wind to contact at the minimal amount of surface area possible. So you want to orient a tent into the wind such that either orient the tent such that you minimize the surface area that the wind sees, or in such a way that the surface areas that it does see are broken up, that there's not a big flat surface. It's a bunch of smaller connected surfaces, but there are breaks in the surfaces that are tensionable, if you follow me. So that's sort of what I think about is, how do we again enclose the person, but allow for wind to break, at least not contact too much surface area as it goes over the top of your tent.
Yeah, I've seen the Stratospire Lee handle wind conditions that it's a really impressive design. It's really unique.
Yeah, that thing's fun to watch in the wind. It's pretty bomber. Of course, a lot of that is design, but a lot of that is the fabric as well, which is just so stiff that it
Mhm.
just doesn't move a lot in the wind.
What about, catenary curves? That's another kind of important design, aesthetic for you guys.
Yeah, well, that's where I guess some of my physics training comes in. I mean, I sort of understood catenary curves pretty well before I got into making tents, but basically gravity acts on all things with mass, and so if you were to imagine a basic A-frame, single pole at front end and back end, and a long ridge line in between it, gravity's pulling down on all that surface between the two poles at each end, and so basically what a catenary curve does is it does it resists what gravity does, which is to pull down on that fabric. So you want to take that fabric that's going to fall down anyway out of the way in some sense. You want to remove the fabric that's going to deflect downward anyway due to gravity. And that's what the curve does is it provides an upward force on all the surfaces between beginning and end to counteract what gravity's doing to your tent structure.
And just to try to describe this, what you're describing is a curve that goes from point to
Hmm.
point, structure to structure. It's very slight, though.
It's very slight. Yep, yep. But if you imagine if you for example make a really simple A-frame tent and you tension it as well as you can, you'll find that it will be inevitably not tight in that center high ridge line from point to point. It can't be because gravity's pulling down on it. So if you were to walk, say, into the middle of that structure and you pinch down it just take your two fingers and pinch down on it, you'll see that you can actually sort of, in some sense, pull out some of that fabric from the middle of the surface. And that's what the catenary curve does for you, is it pulls out that curve, that excess fabric, because gravity's pulling down on it anyway. And that's how I think about it. But essentially, it curves it enough to where there's an upward force on all components of that fabric, and it resists gravity. That's really the whole point of. And yes, and you're absolutely right. You can get deep catenary curves or much more shallow ones, but it needs to be there, or the fabric will inevitably cave in on you due to gravity.
Well, let's talk about fabrics for a second. So you started with sil nylon, and Tarptent kind of
Mhm,
stuck with that for a
mhm.
long time. You've only just now gotten into
Sure.
DCF. Can you talk about that transition?
Yeah, well, you're right. I resisted it for a very long time. Part of me still feels a little dirty in some sense making it because of the expense. My objection has always been that the prohibitive expense of the thing, and yeah, I mean, maybe it's something to do with the way I was raised, but it's just to me to spend $600 or $700 on something to take out into the wilderness where the whole idea is to be minimalist and get away from conspicuous consumption and all that. It just seemed sort of antithetical to that. But I ultimately came around when I took a look at the market and I saw a lot of people spending a lot of money on products that, to me, as a designer, were in my opinion anyway, less than well done. I'll say it that way.
Mm,
And so I just
mhm.
thought, look, in some sense, I was willing to sort of turn the corner on this when I thought, look, if you're going to spend the money anyway, I want to give you a good product. I want to give you something that's well designed.
Mhm.
So I don't know. That's how I got around it. And I will say, having now designed a bunch of these tents, and we're working on more, I can tell you that. And having seen and experienced the fabric in the wild, there are certainly benefits, and there are certainly drawbacks. And I'm happy to talk about those. But overall, I think it does contribute to a very nice product. You have to treat it well, and you have to understand, its upsides and its downsides. But at the end of the day, I think it does make for some really nice performance characteristics. As you noted, the Stratospire Li is just really strong in the wind, and a lot of that has to do with the fabric.
Well, we've actually done a whole podcast on DCF, which
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
participated in. It was one of our very first podcasts. It might actually be our first podcast. I can't quite remember, but we talked a lot about those sorts of things then. So, what I'd like to do with you is talk about, from a design and production standpoint, what are your challenges in
Hmm.
working with that fabric?
Well, I mean, I guess the biggest one, and it didn't actually prove to be as big of a hindrance as I had sort of thought it was going to be, is the whole taping process. Um, because of what happens with DCF and seams, when you start pulling on the fabric, you open up holes. You expand on the existing seam holes, and they never close up again the way that you do on, say, a steel nylon. So you release the tension on a steel nylon product, those seam holes just shut down to where they were before you pulled on it. DCF opens up permanent stretch holes, and so you have to tape it. There's just no other way to do it. But as long as those curves aren't too deep, they're not too extreme, then you can sort of lay a big piece of fabric on the table and go a few inches at a time and tape them. You can't sort of lay a big piece, 8-foot piece of curved seam on a table and expect to tape it all at once. There's just too much curvature there. But you can go a few inches at a time and it all works out. That to me was a little eye opening, but it proved workable. So of course we seam tape everything. And then the other challenge with DCF, and this is maybe not news, but right now, the way that material comes to us and everybody else is that it's 54 inches wide, which, from a design standpoint, makes it challenging to do larger tents. Um, so you really can't, if you want to make, say, a 3-person tent, which several people do, you have to start seaming together panels to make them larger than 54 inches effective width, which is fine. It's doable. It's just that unless you sort of pick the right design, you end up with a lot of fabric waste, which, in the price range of this stuff, it makes for extremely expensive production. So I think we've probably found a way to get into larger tents, coming, but not this year, but certainly for the year after. We're going to get more into bonding and that kind of stuff. So we're going to get more into wider tents as we go. But for right now, that's been one of the design challenges. How do we utilize the 54-inch width, both for larger tents, but also for smaller tents, so as not to waste fabric, because again, as of the expense. So it's really about how do you work around the limited width, and then how do you work around this? The other constraint right now is it comes in 9-meter uh, uh, panels, and then there's 4 of them that are sort of, not includes the wrong word, but there's a distinct break every 9 meters in a 36-meter long roll of Dyneema. So it's weird. It's not a continuous roll. We've heard that that's actually going to change in the relatively short term, which is good news for everybody. But anyway, so Dyneema itself has an unusual width and length, um, requirement that you have to work around.
That's really interesting. This is the kind of stuff that I think maybe not be so obvious to people when they think about designing tents. So the fabric waste thing in terms of
Mm.
design had never occurred to me. What else do you find yourself butting up against when you design shelters?
I mentioned this stretch characteristic with Dyneema. So it's not true. It is what the sort of the conventional word on the street is that Dyneema doesn't stretch, and that's generally true. However, it does stretch and shrink in a permanent way, in a way that say sil nylon does not, and you have to account for that. So when you're designing that, you have to understand that in the long term, Dyneema will shrink a little bit in some directions and stretch in other directions depending on how it's used and how it's tensioned. And so you have to sort of account for that. So, for example, on the Stratospire Li, we had to put in a couple extra clips in some places to attach the interior to the floor, understanding that when new, the
Hmm.
clips are needed, and then as it ages, you can just remove the clips to sort of shrink down the effective in uh, distance between the interior and the fly as the fly shrinks a little bit, if you're following me. So it's sort of like knowing how it is when it's new and knowing what's going to happen in the long term has to be now part of the process that isn't part of the process, or the thinking and the design process for using something like sil nylon. Um, so that's one thing. With respect to Dyneema, with all tents, it's about um, understanding that when you go from curved surfaces to flat um, patterns, which then are sewn together to form your finished structure, there are certain mathematical sh- structures that aren't flattenable. If that's making any sense to you. So, for example, take a globe and cut it in half. If you were to form a structure like that, you can't. It's mathematically impossible to flatten a hemisphere like that. So what you have to do is you have to cut it up into little slices and sew them back together, and then even then account for or understand that it's going to require some stretch um, during setup to
Hmm.
get to that eventual shape that you intended. So, again, this is about understanding that you can do all the design work you want, but if it's not purely mathematically flattenable into a flat shape, there are going to be some compromises, and so you have to work around those and understand that either you can expect your fabric to stretch a little bit to conform to your volume, or understand that it won't, and that it's going to change your design a little bit. This is maybe a little bit long-winded, but it's just understanding that fabrics have different stretch and stress characteristics, and having to design around them is sort of part of the process.
Yeah, and nerd out as much as you would like
Okay.
to here, because
Yeah.
that's what we're here for. We're
Okay.
here for ultimate nerdery. Have you ever gotten, let's say, halfway through a design and just gone, you know what, this is just not going to work?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, I've bloodied my forehead against my computer screen on numerous occasions over all this. Yeah. And then part of it is it looks good on screen, and then you build it and then you realize that you just sort of haven't understood something about it. Again, the stretch characteristics problem, or something having to do with what happens in wind, and not understanding how the forces pull on a panel and then cause some redirection in some other arch or a trekking pole direction or whatever, and you just go to this is just isn't going to work. I have some skeletons in the closet that way for sure.
When that happens, do you try to salvage what is good from the design and sort of transport it into something else?
So the Stratospire design, for example, I worked for years on that, having a basic idea in my head of what I wanted, but just not knowing how to pull it off. I wanted to take kind of a basic A-frame structure and somehow get more usable volume out of that in the same footprint. And I kept playing around with, well, what if I push some trekking poles around? Like, I'm just going to offset them and move them around. At the end of the day, it's all mathematically the same. There's just no way to increase the usable volume inside, no matter what you do with your trekking poles, until I threw the pitch lock corner at it. And then I realized, oh, that's the solution. So you offset the poles and you put the pitch lock in, and now all of a sudden you have dramatically increased your usable volume, and you can still get a symmetrical tension out of the thing. And that was just one of those kind of aha moments I had at one point. uh, and yeah, I mean, I knew what I wanted to do. I just couldn't figure out how to make it happen until that moment.
And for people who aren't familiar with the design, what Henry's talking about here is this is a dual entry, dual vestibule shelter that it sets up with two trekking poles, but the trekking poles are offset so that they're not in your way as you're trying to get in and out of the shelter. It's really slick.
Yeah, and so just if all you did was offset the poles, what happens is that you change the angle on the end closest to the where the pole now is, which is good. You've increased the angle and you get more volume, but you've also shortened the you've lessened the angle at the other end and you decrease the usable volume. And so that's the problem. You can't do one without the other, or you don't end up with anything better. And in fact, I think worse than the original classic A-frame design. But anyway, yeah. So yeah. I mean, like I said originally, I mean, I talked about certain design elements that, of course, work, and it's just finding the right combinations. I think that's a lot of what I think about these days is how can you recombine some really proven simple things to solve the problem.
Do you find that as you added more and more of these simple proven things to your toolkit, let's call it, do you find you have less failures in your designs? Like, are you getting better at this or is it still a struggle?
I Well, I would hope so. Um, I'm getting a lot better at CAD modeling. I'll say that. We use a product called Rhinoceros 3D, and we use it because so there are a number of CAD modeling programs on the market. This one's particularly well attuned to working with surfaces, and they're called NURBS surfaces for you nerds out there. And but the funny thing is I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. I really can't. I'm a terrible artist, but I know what I want the thing to look like, and I can make it live on screen, and that then helps me. Things like put some sort of dummy models inside the tent design and go, oh yeah, this is what it would feel like to sit up and lie down, and what happens if you turn around, and what happens if you stick your feet out the door, and all that stuff that I can do virtually that I couldn't really feasibly do any other way. So it's been a real uh, revelation for me to sort of get to that point of, oh, I see how I can design things without having any idea how to draw them on paper, or without having to actually build the thing, hack it together out of some fabric and then go pinch and pull and go from there. Just to be able to do all this virtually is, it's an amazing thing, I think.
Is this the same software that you use to generate your 3D models, usable volume models that you put on the website?
Yes. Yep. That's it.
Do you have a formal process by which you test a design once it's assembled?
Well, yeah, I've gotten pretty good initially at setting things up and sort of walking around it and pushing and pulling on it and simulate what I think happens in the wind and the snow and the rain. And that's my first pass. Is I gave it a what I think is a pretty good. This is what's going to happen to it when we get it out there in the real world and things start beating it up. So that's the first pass, and of course we do some field testing and all of that. And the other thing about design, I will say, and this has to do with production, is understanding, well, having enough of a sense of what happens in the real world beyond just wind and rain, but people tripping over guy lines and getting in and out of doors, uh, and then so there's the usability part of it, but there's also the manufacturing bit of it. Like things need to be reinforced in the right places,
Mm-hmm.
or they will inevitably fail. So because people trip over guy lines and trekking poles slip out and cording breaks. I mean, all things happen, and so it's sort of trying to anticipate those and then how to at least do our best to anticipate that certain stresses, unusually large stresses, will happen to certain parts of the tent that are beyond just wind gust or a hard rain.
What is your greatest achievement as a designer?
Hmm. Um, maybe that I've made a career out of it. I suppose I don't know.
uh,
Um,
well, what think about it this way. What's a problem that you really struggled with and then suddenly you had a solution for it?
Well, I mean, we mentioned the Stratospire, which was a for me it was a real an achievement for me. Um, Prior to that, it was I mean, I don't. This is not a big deal, but prior to that, it was actually we have a patent on the double rainbow design for the freestanding setup. Which, if you're not familiar with that, so the there's nothing sort of unusual or novel about a single arch pole tent with a little cross strut hold it up. But what I brought to the party, um, which some people find useful, is replacing the four corner stakes with a pair of trekking poles. So that the shaft of the trekking pole, you clamp that down at ground level at the end of the arch pole, and then the stable pole at either end is then you run that you attach your corner guy lines to that, and then the whole thing becomes freestanding and reasonably stable. And that's hadn't been done before, and um, for some people we find it useful. And the other thing I will say is that this is a little bit tangential, but we do a number of patents, and the reason I do them is it's really to well, to protect our work a little bit, but also I think it helps us and it helps others in the sense that we don't have to step on each other's toes quite so much. I mean, I everything that we do, I try to bring a little twist to it. That's one of my design ethics things is I try not to duplicate completely what's been done before anyway. I try and do something a little different. And that particular design element, I mean, the double rainbow sets up just fine staked and we're all good. It's just that that's a little extra feature that hadn't been done before. And there was a situation that came up a few years ago when a large tent manufacturer added that feature to a similar product and publicized it. And there was this little backlash, I know, on BPL where people started pointing that out because, hey, isn't that what the double rainbow does or the rainbow does? Uh, and then quietly that manufacturer removed that feature from their website a few days later. And it was good because it was just like no lawyers had to get involved, and they understood the problem, and it all got solved, and we all moved on. That was actually kind of a cool thing.
Is your emphasis on trying to add that little twist to your designs, is that some combination of, like, creativity and trying to give yourself an edge in marketing, but also just like you said, not stepping on toes, like just trying to make sure that you have a product that you're not directly competing with some of the other cottage guys?
Yeah, no, I think it's a little bit of everything. It's I derive, I have a real passion for design, and I have a real passion for doing things, making products that work for me in whatever way, shape, or form, and uh, I feel good about putting out a product that's just not quite like everything else, because at some point then it just comes down to how do you manufacture it most cheaply, and I've just never been about that. I don't know. Um, but yeah, I like putting products out there that are a little bit off, not off in a good way, a little bit different from everything else is out there on the market in some way.
Let's talk a little bit about the business side because chances are somebody is listening to this who, has a sewing machine in their garage and
Mhm.
they're like sew nylon together surrounded by feathers or something. But how did you go from, okay, you're getting, requests online for plans or versions of your shelter to where we are now? Like, what was that journey?
So way back in the day. So again, a lot of this had to do with my wife Cynthia, and now my co-owner. We co-run the company. Her name's Cynthia. She and I uh, back in originally it was about an attempt to make something that worked better for her, and
Mhm.
then I put so much time into it that I went back to the original site where I published my original plans and just said, hey, I thanks for all your emails. If you, I have worked really hard on this problem, and if you're interested, I think I have something that is a little easier to set up, and I have, you know, I might be able to get a few made if you're interested. Because I kept saying, if you want this original one, go sew it yourself. I said, well, I think I have someone who might sew it. If you're interested, let me know. And I launched tarptent.com actually on Tax Day 2002, and immediately we got, I don't know what it was, 30 orders or something the first day, which just blew me away. I had no
Mm-hmm.
concept that there would be this sort of interest. I thought we'd get a couple. Anyway, and so that just sort of drove it. It was just, I was just trying to fill orders, and I had other careers, and I did all this stuff on the side, and it was like that for a couple years. And then I even went to graduate school, and it was during that whole thing where ultimately we got a little notice in Backpacker magazine. I was like, I can't do two things well at the same time. So I was trying to
Mm-hmm.
teach physics, and I was trying to do this, and I couldn't do them both well at the same time, and I had to make a choice. And that happened in about 2004, I think. And so I said, well, I have other options if this doesn't work out, but I'm going to give this a shot. And so it went from there.
How much of a leap was it? Like, was it obvious that, okay, if I quit my job, I'm going to be okay? Or was it, this may not work?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a leap. But at some level, I felt like, I could make it work for a while, even on a somewhat limited income. That I was willing to go there, and knowing that I had a good education, I had other options to go if this didn't work out. I wasn't so tied to it that it was make this work or die. I mean, I was just like, I'm just going to see where this goes, and if it doesn't work, it's fine. I'll go back to what I was doing. So I never felt like it was that urgent that it has to work, but I was willing to do what I could to make it work.
What were some of the struggles that you faced in the early days once you were doing it full time?
Well, the same struggles we face now mainly is it's so much of this is about production. It's about day in and day out getting the products made, well, and to keep people on track and make sure that the product we put out last week is the same one we put out this week with respect to quality and design, and inevitably things move around. And everybody goes through this who makes things, but it's the production quality and consistency day in and day out that continues to be the biggest struggle, I think.
So you guys sew and assemble the products in Seattle, right?
Yep, currently it's all done there. Yep.
And that's kind of one of your company values or something that you are sort of proud of, right?
Yeah, it has been to date. I have nothing. It's just from a production standpoint. Well, the other, again, back to this consistency over time. It's to have access to a factory that's relatively short plane flight away, and certainly a same time zone kind of phone call. Just to me, just works better. I will say we've really had some struggles in 2019. Seattle, as you know, is the home of Amazon, and we, along with a lot of other smaller companies, have really suffered at the hands of a lot of people leaving to go to Amazon. In
Mm.
our case, not to go sew, but to move boxes or whatever it is, and just overall, just make a little bit more money. So uh, you're going to see some production changes from us in 2020, but we will continue to manufacture in Seattle, and but we'll have some other options going forward.
Anything you can talk about, or you want to keep it under wraps for now?
Um, well, I will say that we do intend some new Dyneema products in 2020. We're kind of excited about them. And I like this whole design thing as I said, it is a bit organic. We keep working with stuff, and then an idea will hit, and let's explore that. And so we build it, and if we like it, we go forward. If we don't like it, we take something from it and move on. I don't have a strict timeline or schedule of, this year we have to do 4 new products. It's not like that. It's just, what are we missing? What haven't we solved yet? What else is out there? And the other thing I will say is where we've always been not different in the sense of other cottage gear companies, but different in the sense of bigger companies, is that we've always been direct to consumer, and I don't want to change that. So I've gotten so much good feedback from so many people over the years. And I love having conversations with users. Someone, hey, I just used the whatever on the PCT, and here's what I have to say. It's like, this is great. I mean,
Hmm.
you don't if you're a retail manufacturer, your customer is not the end user. Your customer is the store that buys it from you, and that's not what we do at all. And I don't ever want to change that. I love selling tents to people who use them and then who give us feedback, and it helps us make better products.
How do you juggle your duties as, let's say, just running the business and everything that entails, and then also trying to be a designer and an artist? Do you struggle to carve time out for that?
Yeah, I mean, historically, it's always there's always it's a seasonal business. We do sell all over the world, so it's a little less seasonal than it might be. So when the Australians get all excited, of course, it's winter here, and but generally, our we do have a slower season, and it's typically September, October, November sort of time frame, and that's when I've done most of the design work overall in the past. It's Things are changing a little bit, and but I still, I'm hoping that 2020 will get back to that point where I will be able to, really carve out a distinct season or distinct time blocks during the season where I can, really focus on design elements. I will say that it's not just me anymore. So we have a mechanical engineer we hired a few years ago, and she and I do most of the design work now, and it's really been invaluable to have another person to bounce ideas off of, and we work well together, and it's fun to have someone else who thinks about tents all the time.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that because I think that might be a bit of a struggle for a cottage guy wanting to go from, you know, okay, I'm ready to move to the next
Yeah.
step. How did you go about that? How did you find someone who shared your design
Yeah.
ideas?
Well, we've had a few interns over the years. People just sort of contact us out of the blue, and we had one before her, and then we had her, and it just worked out. I mean, we were fortunate that uh, that she has a lot of mechanical training, but she's also loves to sew, and it was just a really good fit. And so I've always been open to the idea of bringing people in and seeing how it all works out. But in this case, it just worked, and so we're very lucky that way. But yeah, it does relieve. It does at some point. The thing about production is you need the original product, the idea. You need someone to make it, but you need to stay on it. You need to stay on the quality control. You need to stay on the small updates over time to the product uh, as we get you know hey, I love your tent, but could you make the following change? And go, yeah, that's a great idea. We'll roll that into the next production. But that we need people to stay on that and to work through that forward. You don't just design a product and then go on vacation. It's so much more than that.
What's something you wish had gone a different way for you? So it may be in the company, it may be a design that you really thought was gonna fly, and then it just didn't really do what it was supposed to. Do you have any examples?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we've certainly had products over the years that for one reason or another didn't do as well as I thought they would do. Um, and the one sort of fabric experiment that we've done prior to Dyneema, which wasn't an experiment, but it was a new thing for us, was the Tyvek fabric. So we used to make this tent called the Sublight, which was a little solo tent, with a couple of trekking poles, and really light, and it worked really well in some situations. Like it's a fantastic sunshade tent because that white fabric reflects so much heat energy that it stayed really cool in there in the hot sun. It's just that it had some other problems with tearing a little too easily, and of course we couldn't claim it being waterproof. It proved to be pretty highly water resistant, but not waterproof. So we ultimately had to table that one. But part of me still wants to make another Tyvek tent someday because I think in the right situations, it's kind of it's an interesting fabric for that reason.
What do you see as the next frontier for shelters? Is it weights are gonna continue to decrease? Is it increased performance? Is it new fabrics?
Maybe in the context of answering that question, I will say there are trends in the tent industry that have me a little concerned. and notably, it is this t- t- this obsession with getting lighter and lighter, and so what's happened with in the industry is that, and I'm not against getting lighter and lighter. It's just that at some point compromises are made, and it's a question of what compromises do you
Hmm.
make. Um, Understanding that they are in fact compromises, and at some point they become compromises that just aren't worth it. And so, to me, when you get down into like 7D fabrics that just aren't very waterproof, and then you're expecting them to do the job when it really counts, it's a little scary. And I get the idea that you want to sell tents, but I think it's true in all industries. But when you put a product out into a market that's not as knowledgeable maybe as it should be, to not know the difference between one fabric or another, and then to expect there's an expectation of what it's going to do for me, which is great until it doesn't do what you need it to do when it really needs to do what you need it to do. If you know what I'm saying. So it's a little concerning to me that the lightweight thing is pushed to the point where I think it's resulting in some finished products that are too compromised. I'll say that. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I will say that, as I'm sure it's going to happen, there are going to be some new fabrics that'll come on the market probably after I'm retired. But some just incredibly lightweight carbon based fabric that will be uh, another step up from anything we've ever seen before. I'm sure that's coming. I think tent designs. There's always room for some advancement. I mean, I've been working at this long enough to know that there are only so many ways to hold up a tent. There are only so many skeletons you can build, and then it's the fabrics, of
Right.
course, are the big thing that I think will continue to evolve.
What about Sil Poly? Some people are kind of excited about that. Other people are like, nah. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So we've tested a little bit. As with all fabrics, there are pluses and minuses. Um, the plus being that it tends to absorb very little water when wet, which of course is the same with Dyneema. So that's good. It isn't true. The one sort of misperception I think about Sil Poly is there's this perception that it's non-stretch. And it is non-stretch with respect that the stretch doesn't get worse when it gets wet, but it's not true that it's non-stretch. So there's a lot of bias stretch in that fabric, at least in the lightweight fabrics that we've seen. And so, as a wind panel, as a wind support panel, it's inherently there are some inherent limitations to that fabric, and the pressure ratings tend to not be quite as high as certainly as the steel nylon that we're using. So, is it a useful fabric? Yeah. It's just as with all fabrics, there are limitations. Whether we'll put it into anything that we make going forward, we could well. It's not, it hasn't happened yet, and I not likely for 2020, but maybe 2021. We'll see.
I want to circle back around to something you said when we were talking about DCF, and that
Mhm.
was that what kept you from jumping into it was basically producing an $800
Yeah,
shelter.
yeah,
Um, and I got the impression that producing affordable gear was something that was important to you, but we didn't really
yeah,
dig into it specifically. Is that
yeah.
something that's kind of always in the back of your mind?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and yeah. I mean, so right now the sort of least expensive tent we make is the Pro Trail, which is a little single tent that uses a couple trekking poles, and that's down at 229. And you can certainly get cheaper than that at other big box tents at big stores. But that is the most minimalist, cheapest thing that we make, and I think it's good value. It's just over a pound and a half, and it does the job, keeps the rain and the bugs off you. It's very similar, really, in form and function to the tent that I used all those years ago on the PCT. And I have no intention of getting away from that. I would not want to still be running this company and be exclusively high end
Mm.
tents. I don't want to go down that road.
Why?
Well, because I want to open up backpacking. I want to make backpacking or outdoor experiences accessible to as many people as I can.
Mhm.
And at some point, spending 2 to 3 times that much money on a tent for something that might just get used a few days a year, if you're you're someone who just doesn't have time or doesn't have just trying it out or whatever. I just it to to me, it's a disincentive to go out there and use it at all, or I mean, to go out there and have the experience at all because it's so expensive.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately is how to make this world more accessible to, um, people who aren't necessarily in it right now. And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's a good thought. Where do you see the future of the cottage industry?
With respect to outdoor products, or just in, I mean, I think there's always going to be room for people who turn passions into companies, which I think is my take on the cottage industry. It's certainly in my situation and other people that I know. And starting any business is a risk, but it's also very much capital driven. So it's the cost to entry. And so for things like these products, the cost to entry isn't very great. I mean, you need some initial materials and you need some way to, make the thing. But at the end of the day, you can do something like this with not a lot of capital. And that's how we started. It was all completely bootstrap. Little money there, a little money there. We'd sell a few tents, turn that back into new products, and go forward. And that's, I don't see that changing with respect to this industry, although Dyneema changes the equation a little bit because
Mm.
that's many, many thousands of dollars to get into that. But I think as long as people have passions and can make products to enhance their own passions, I think it's always going to be viable.
Is there anything that you wanted to say about Tarptent or what you do or how you think that you haven't got a chance to say yet?
Well, again, this has been a passion for me, and it's what drives me, and I will keep doing this until uh, I don't have that passion anymore, and it hasn't happened yet, and I don't know when it's going to happen. Um, I will say that, as with all businesses, there are when you're in it, eyeball deep, in any business, the 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 downside is that you don't have time for much of anything else. And
Mm.
I miss my younger days when I had a lot more time to hike. And it is frustrating that the more hours I spend on this, the fewer hours I have available to go hiking. And so the last few years have been pretty limited for hiking. I did have a really fun hike with a friend I met on the PCT, and we went and hiked in the wind in the Ruby Mountains, just south of Elko, Nevada, this summer. And it was just great. It was just like two guys who love hiking, and we just rambled along, and it was so freeing. It was just great. And I want to find ways to, have more of those experiences and still run the company. And I think, my family and I think are going to try and do the TRT next summer, which I've done before, but we haven't done it as a family, and so I think that'll be fun. So it's I can make all the products I want to for the experience, but I need to have the experience to go with it.
So how do you see that happening? How do you carve out time to do that?
Well, a lot of it is in planning, getting people here into Tarptent who can sort of take things over, run things, and then have me and my family leave and not and give us some confidence that things will be fine when we come back. So I think we're getting there. I think we have some good people, and I think we've tried this before, and it's worked. And I think it's just it's that how much time we can afford to do that and still be okay. We're working that out, but a lot of this is just making sure that we don't let our company down and we don't let our customers down if we do and decide to take off for a bit.
Yeah, it's probably a lot of our listeners have had some experience with taking what is a passion, turning it into your living, and then not having time for the passion anymore.
Yeah.
It's more sadistic than just working long hours at a bank and not having time to hike, right?
Yeah, it's true. But I feel very fortunate. I'm extremely lucky to get to do this and to have lots of at least superficial relationships with lots of people who are loving me being outside, and I derive a lot of pleasure from that, I think.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here burning to know what shelters you're dropping next year. So maybe I can get someone from Tarptent to tell me here in the next few days. Maybe we'll see what happens.
All right,
All
cool.
right, Henry. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah,
Really appreciate it.
you're very welcome. Nice to talk to you.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast. The Backpacking Light podcast is supported by a backpackinglight.com membership fees. A backpackinglight.com membership gives you access to nearly 20 years of article archives, community forums, online education, and much more. You can join our community right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe. You can download the show notes for this episode, which will have links to all the shelters we talked about with Henry and a couple other things at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please, please, please leave us a review. It really does help other people find the show. Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall, and if I can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from